The Miller family had always taken pride in their farm, a sprawling estate nestled in the rolling hills of rural Wisconsin. John Miller, a rugged and hard-working man in his 40s, had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The farm was a symbol of their legacy, a testament to their dedication and perseverance. Life on the farm was simple yet fulfilling. John's wife, Mary, a kind-hearted woman with a nurturing spirit, managed the household and helped with the lighter farm chores. Their 2 teenage children, Sam and Emily, pitched in whenever they could, balancing their schoolwork with the demands of farm life. Sam, at 17, was strong and eager to prove himself, while 16-year-old Emily had a keen mind and a love for animals. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, John made his way to the barn. The air was cool, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. He whistled a cheerful tune, enjoying the tranquility of the early morning. However, his pleasant mood quickly dissipated when he opened the barn doors. Inside, several of their cows lay motionless on the straw-covered floor. Their eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the void, and their bodies appeared unnaturally thin. John's heart raced as he knelt beside one of the cows, his fingers trembling as he examined it more closely. He noticed 2 small puncture wounds on the animal's neck, and when he touched the area around the wounds, the skin was cold and lifeless. Mary, Sam, Emily. John's voice echoed through the barn, filled with urgency and fear. Within moments, his family arrived, their expressions turning from confusion to horror as they took in the scene. "What happened?" Mary asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," John replied, his brow furrowed. "But whatever it is, it's not natural." They spent the next few hours examining the other cows, all of which showed the same signs of blood loss. John and Sam moved the bodies to the side, while Mary and Emily checked the remaining livestock for any signs of illness or injury. The remaining animals seemed healthy but agitated, as if sensing the danger that lurked nearby. The Millers initially suspected a wild animal, perhaps a pack of coyotes or wolves, but the precision of the puncture wounds and the complete drainage of blood didn't match any known predator. John decided to seek advice from their neighbor, Tom Jenkins, a seasoned farmer with years of experience. Tom listened attentively as John described the situation. He scratched his head and frowned. "I've never seen anything like it, John. Coyotes and wolves usually go for the meat, not just the blood. This sounds like something else entirely." "Something else?" John asked, his voice edged with desperation. "Like what?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, you need to be careful. Set up night watches and keep your family close. We can't afford to lose any more livestock." Determined to protect his farm and family, John took Tom's advice to heart. That evening, he gathered Sam and Emily in the living room and explained the plan. They would take turns watching the barn at night, armed with rifles and flashlights, ready to confront whatever was preying on their animals. The first night of the watch was tense. John and Sam sat in the barn, listening intently to every sound. The wind rustled through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the distance. Hours passed, and despite their vigilance, nothing unusual happened. As dawn approached, they breathed a sigh of relief, and returned to the house. But the following morning, their relief turned to dread when they found another cow dead, drained of blood just like the others. Frustration and fear gnawed at John's resolve. He knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a wild animal. Over the next few nights, they fortified the barn with additional locks and boarded up any gaps or holes. They laid traps around the perimeter, hoping to catch whatever was responsible. Despite their efforts, the attacks continued, and more animals fell victim. John's worry grew with each passing day. He could see the toll it was taking on his family. Mary's face was pale, and she slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares. Sam and Emily, once full of energy and enthusiasm, were now exhausted and fearful. The farm, once a place of joy and hard work, had become a battleground against an unseen enemy. Desperate for answers, John decided to visit the nearest town and speak with Father O'Reilly, the local priest known for his wisdom and knowledge of folklore. The drive to town was long and filled with anxious thoughts. John replayed the events in his mind, searching for any clue or explanation. Father O'Reilly welcomed John into the rectory, offering him a seat and a cup of tea. John recounted the horrifying events on his farm, his voice trembling with emotion. The priest listened intently, his face growing more solemn with each word. "John, it sounds like you're dealing with something beyond the natural world," Father O'Reilly said quietly. He reached for a leather-bound book on his desk and opened it to a page filled with ancient symbols and drawings. There have been legends of creatures that feed on the blood of the living, known as vampires. They are cunning and ruthless, preying on the weak and vulnerable. John's heart pounded in his chest. Vampires. But those are just stories, aren't they? Many stories have a basis in truth, Father O'Reilly replied. You must take every precaution to protect your family. Here, take this. He handed John a crucifix, garlic cloves, and a bundle of wooden stakes. These are traditional methods of warding off vampires. Place the crucifixes and garlic around your home and barn, and if you encounter one, use the stakes to defend yourself. John accepted the items, feeling a mix of fear and determination. Thank you, Father. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family. As he drove back to the farm, John's mind raced with thoughts of vampires and the impending battle. He knew they were up against something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined, but he was resolved to fight for his family's survival. Little did he know that this was only the beginning of their nightmare, and the true horror had yet to unfold. Armed with Father O'Reilly's advice and the items he had given him, John returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. He gathered his family in the living room, where the flickering fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was tense, each family member sensing the gravity of the situation. John laid out the crucifixes, garlic cloves, and wooden stakes on the coffee table. We're dealing with something far more dangerous than wild animals, he began, his voice steady but grim. Father O'Reilly believes we're up against vampires. A stunned silence filled the room. Mary's eyes widened in disbelief, while Sam and Emily exchanged worried glances. Vampires? Mary echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. But those are just myths, aren't they? Apparently not, John replied, his gaze unwavering. We need to take every precaution. We'll place these crucifixes and garlic around the house and barn, and if we encounter one of them, we use these stakes. The family spent the next few hours fortifying their home and barn. They hung crucifixes above doorways and windows, placed garlic cloves in strategic locations, and ensured the wooden stakes were within easy reach. As night fell, a sense of unease settled over them. The once cozy farmhouse now felt like a fortress under siege. John and Sam took the first watch, their rifles slung over their shoulders and flashlights in hand. The barn was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of hay or the distant howl of a coyote. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Around midnight, as John was about to suggest switching shifts, they heard a faint rustling noise outside the barn. They exchanged tense glances and crept towards the source of the sound, flashlights cutting through the darkness. What they saw made their blood run cold. A shadowy figure was bent over one of their cows, its movements swift and precise. The cow let out a weak, pitiful moan as the figure's head dipped, and a flash of moonlight revealed the creature's fangs glistening with blood. Sam let out an involuntary gasp, and the figure turned its head, crimson eyes locking onto theirs. Without hesitation, John raised his rifle and fired, but the bullet whizzed through the air as the vampire moved with supernatural speed, disappearing into the shadows. John and Sam stood frozen, the reality of their situation sinking in. They were not dealing with a mere animal, but a creature of legend, a vampire. They rushed back to the house, breathless and shaken. Mary and Emily, who had been anxiously waiting, jumped up at the sound of the door slamming. "What happened?" Mary asked, her voice laced with fear. "We saw it," Sam said, his face pale. "It was a vampire, just like Father O'Reilly said." Mary covered her mouth in horror, while Emily's eyes filled with tears. John put a reassuring arm around his daughter. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "We just need to stay vigilant and protect each other." The following day, the Millers fortified their defenses even further. They built barriers around the barn, using wooden planks and barbed wire. John and Sam crafted additional stakes, and Mary prepared a mixture of holy water, sprinkling it around the property. Despite their exhaustion, they were determined to defend their home. As night fell, the tension was palpable. John and Sam took turns patrolling the barn, while Mary and Emily kept watch from the house. The hours dragged on, each creak and rustle heightening their anxiety. Just after midnight, John spotted movement near the edge of the property. He motioned for Sam to stay back and cautiously approached. As he drew closer, he saw not one but several figures moving in the darkness, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized the true extent of the threat. They were dealing with a coven of vampires, not just a single rogue. One of the vampires, older and more imposing than the others, stepped forward. His presence exuded an air of authority, and John knew instinctively that this was the leader. The vampire's gaze locked onto John, a cold smile playing on his lips. "Good evening," the vampire said, his voice smooth and unsettling. "I am Victor. I believe we have not been formally introduced." John tightened his grip on his rifle. "What do you want?" Victor chuckled softly. "Isn't it obvious? My coven and I have been using your farm as a feeding ground for quite some time. We have no intention of leaving." "Then we'll drive you out," John retorted, trying to keep his voice steady. Victor's smile widened, revealing his sharp fangs. "You could try, but you would not succeed. However, I am a reasonable man. I propose a deal. In exchange for a steady supply of your livestock, we will leave your family unharmed." John hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. He knew they were outmatched, and the safety of his family was paramount. Reluctantly, he nodded. "Fine, but if you harm any of us, the deal is off." "Agreed," Victor said, his smile never wavering. "We will feed only on your animals. You have my word." With that, Victor and his coven melted back into the shadows, leaving John standing alone in the cold night. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he had no choice. He had to protect his family, even if it meant making a deal with the devil. Over the next few days, the Millers adjusted to their uneasy truce with the vampires. The livestock continued to suffer, but the family remained unharmed. However, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Mary, Sam, and Emily were growing increasingly pale and fatigued, their once vibrant spirits dimming. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, John noticed dark circles under Mary's eyes and a strange lethargy in Sam and Emily's movements. He tried to dismiss his fears, attributing their condition to stress and sleepless nights. But deep down, he knew something more sinister was at play. Determined to get to the bottom of it, John decided to keep a closer watch on his family. That night, as the house lay in silence, he crept into each of their rooms, watching over them as they slept. To his horror, he noticed faint, almost imperceptible puncture marks on their necks, similar to those on the cows. Realization dawned on him like a cold, dark cloud. The vampires had not honored their agreement. They had been feeding on his family, slowly turning them into thralls, bound to their will. John's heart ached with guilt and rage. He had failed to protect his loved ones, and now they were paying the price. With renewed determination, John knew he had to confront Victor once more, to find a way to break the vampire's hold on his family before it was too late. Little did he know, the true horror of their situation was yet to be revealed, and their battle for survival had only just begun. Determined to save his family, John steeled himself for another encounter with Victor. As dusk approached, he armed himself with the crucifix Father O'Reilly had given him and tucked several wooden stakes into his belt. He kissed Mary, Sam, and Emily on their foreheads, promising he would return with a solution. The night was eerily silent as John approached the barn. The full moon cast long shadows across the farm, and the cool breeze sent shivers down his spine. He could feel the eyes of the vampires on him even before he saw them. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the open, calling out into the darkness. "Victor, show yourself!" John's voice echoed through the night, filled with anger and desperation. A moment later, Victor emerged from the shadows, flanked by several of his coven members. His eyes glowed with a predatory light, and his smile was one of amusement. "John," Victor greeted him smoothly, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" "You lied to me," John spat, his grip tightening on the crucifix. "You said you would leave my family unharmed, but you've been feeding on them." Victor's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild annoyance. "You misunderstand, John. I agreed not to harm them, and I haven't. They are alive, are they not?" "Barely," John retorted. "You're turning them into thralls, just like your victims. This was not our agreement." Victor stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. The agreement was for your livestock, and we have respected that. But understand this, we are vampires. It is in our nature to feed. Your family's blood has given us strength, and in return, they are still alive. That is more than I can say for most who encounter us. John felt a surge of hopelessness, but pushed it aside. I want a new deal. Leave my family alone. Feed only on the livestock as we agreed, but never touch my family again. Victor studied John for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're in no position to negotiate, John. You are outnumbered and outmatched, but I do admire your tenacity. He paused, as if considering. Perhaps there is a way we can come to a new understanding. John's hope flickered, fragile and tentative. What do you want? Victor's smile returned, more sinister than before. A blood bond. You will willingly give your blood to me, allowing me to take what I need when I need it. In exchange, I will ensure your family is left unharmed. They will remain safe and untouched. John's heart pounded. He knew what this meant. He would become a living blood source for Victor, a prisoner of his own body. But the thought of his family suffering was unbearable. He had to protect them, no matter the cost. Fine, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. I agree to your terms. Excellent, Victor purred. He extended his hand, and John hesitated for a moment before grasping it. Victor's grip was cold and strong, and John could feel the vampiric power coursing through him. With the deal struck, Victor and his coven retreated into the shadows, leaving John standing alone in the moonlight. He felt a strange mix of relief and dread. He had secured his family's safety, but at what cost? Returning to the house, John found Mary, Sam, and Emily in the living room, anxiously waiting for him. He explained the new deal, omitting the more disturbing details to spare them further worry. They were relieved, but also sensed the weight of the sacrifice John had made. That night, as John lay in bed, the reality of his decision settled over him like a heavy blanket. He had saved his family, but he had also bound himself to a monster. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their nightmare. Over the following weeks, the changes in the Miller household were palpable. The family's health began to improve, and the color slowly returned to their faces. John, however, grew weaker and more pale with each passing day. He often woke in the middle of the night to find Victor standing over him, draining his blood with a detached, almost clinical precision. The process left John feeling drained and disoriented, but he bore it stoically, knowing it was the price he had to pay. Mary noticed the toll it was taking on John and confronted him one evening. "You're not telling me everything, are you?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. John hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I'm not, but you don't need to worry. I'm doing this for you, for Sam and Emily. We'll be safe." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, trusting John's judgment. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," John said, though he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it. As the days turned into weeks, John's strength waned, and he struggled to keep up with the demands of the farm. Sam and Emily took on more responsibilities, their bond with their father growing stronger as they saw the sacrifices he was making. But deep down, John knew that Victor's promises were fragile and the vampire's hunger insatiable. He could sense their eyes on him, always watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. The farm had become a delicate balance of life and death, with John's blood the only thing keeping the fragile peace. One stormy night, John decided to confront Victor once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that the vampires had other plans, that their hunger would eventually turn back to his family. He needed to find a way to break the bond and rid their farm of the undead menace for good. As lightning flashed and thunder rumbled, John made his way to the barn, the crucifix and stakes in hand. He knew it was a dangerous gamble, but he had no choice. He had to protect his family, no matter the cost. He entered the barn, finding Victor and his coven waiting for him, as if they had anticipated his arrival. Victor's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. "Back so soon, John." "This ends now," John said, his voice resolute. "You promised to leave my family alone, but I don't trust you. I want you gone, for good." Victor laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the barn. "You are brave, John, but foolish. You cannot defeat us. The bond is unbreakable." John raised the crucifix, its silver gleaming in the dim light. "I will find a way. I will protect my family." Victor's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "So be it," he hissed, and the vampires lunged at John, their fangs bared and eyes blazing. John fought with every ounce of strength he had left, wielding the crucifix and stakes with desperate determination. But he was outnumbered, and the vampires' speed and strength were overwhelming. In his final moments, John realized the true horror of his situation. He had fought valiantly, but the odds had always been against him. As Victor's fangs sank into his neck, John's last thought was of his family and a desperate hope that they would find a way to survive without him. As the rain poured down outside, mingling with the blood on the barn floor, John Miller's sacrifice was complete. The Miller farm, once a place of life and hope, was now a battleground of darkness and despair, with no escape from the bloodthirsty monsters that ruled their lives. The storm raged on as John's lifeless body lay on the barn floor, drained of the last ounce of his blood. Victor and his coven stood over him, their hunger temporarily sated, but their dark eyes gleaming with malice. The deal had been struck, but they had no intention of honoring it. The Millers were mere pawns in their insidious game. As dawn approached, the vampires retreated to their underground lair, leaving the barn and the rest of the farm in eerie silence. Mary, Sam, and Emily, unaware of the tragedy that had befallen John, awoke to another day, hoping against hope that their father's efforts had kept them safe. When they discovered John's body in the barn, a collective scream of horror pierced the morning air. Mary collapsed beside him, clutching his cold hand, her tears mixing with the rainwater on the ground. Sam and Emily stood frozen, their faces pale with shock and grief. "What happened?" Sam choked out, his voice trembling. "How did this happen?" Mary, her face streaked with tears, shook her head. "I don't know. He went to confront them again, but they..." Her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Emily, her mind racing, remembered the crucifix and the stakes John had taken with him. "We have to do something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We can't let his sacrifice be in vain." The three of them buried John beside the barn, a simple wooden cross marking his grave. The loss weighed heavily on their hearts, but they knew they had to continue his fight. They couldn't allow the vampires to destroy everything John had worked so hard to protect. Mary, Sam, and Emily fortified the house and barn even further, determined to honor John's memory by doing everything in their power to defend their home. They laid traps, hung more garlic, and kept the wooden stakes close at hand. Despite their grief, they found strength in each other, vowing to keep the farm safe from the undead menace. The next few nights were tense and filled with dread. The family took turns keeping watch, each of them haunted by the image of John's lifeless body. They knew the vampires were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. On the fourth night, as Sam kept watch from the barn's loft, he noticed movement near the edge of the property. He grabbed his rifle and aimed, his heart pounding in his chest. As the figures came closer, he recognized Victor and his coven, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Sam raised the alarm, and Mary and Emily rushed to his side, armed and ready. The family stood together, their faces set with determination. They would not go down without a fight. Victor stepped forward, his smile as cold as the night air. "You've done well to survive this long," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But it's time for you to join your father." "You won't touch us," Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We'll fight you with everything we have." Victor's eyes flashed with anger. "So be it. You will regret defying me." The battle that ensued was fierce and brutal. The Millers fought with a desperation born of love and loss, wielding their weapons with determined precision. Mary thrust a wooden stake into the chest of a vampire that lunged at her, its body crumbling to dust before her eyes. Sam fired his rifle, his aim steady despite his shaking hands. Emily wielded a makeshift spear, her movements quick and agile. But the vampires were relentless. They moved with supernatural speed, their fangs gleaming in the moonlight. One by one, the Millers began to tire, their movements growing slower and less coordinated. The vampires seized the opportunity, attacking with renewed ferocity. In a desperate bid to save her children, Mary charged at Victor, her spear aimed at his heart. Victor caught her wrist with a crushing grip, his smile triumphant. "You are brave but foolish," he sneered, twisting her arm and sending the spear clattering to the ground. Sam and Emily rushed to their mother's aid, but they were quickly overpowered by the other vampires. The three of them were forced to their knees, their weapons taken from them. Victor stood before them, his expression a mix of amusement and disdain. "I had hoped you would accept your fate gracefully," he said. "But it seems I was mistaken. Now you will all suffer." He reached down and grabbed a handful of Mary's hair, forcing her to look up at him. "You should have accepted my offer. Your father's sacrifice was in vain." Mary glared up at him, defiance burning in her eyes. "You'll never win," she spat. "We'll fight you until our last breath." Victor's smile widened. "Then let us see how long you last." With a nod from Victor, the vampires moved in, their fangs bared and eyes gleaming with hunger. The Millers braced themselves, knowing that their fight was far from over. They had lost John, but they would not lose each other without a battle. As the vampires closed in, the family's bond and determination flared brightly, their last stand a testament to their love and resilience. The night echoed with the sounds of their struggle, a fight that would be remembered long after the dawn broke and the blood-soaked farm lay silent once more. For years, the residents of Evergreen Apartments had been plagued by strange occurrences. The building, a once grand structure now faded with time, sat on the edge of town, surrounded by tall, imposing trees that seemed to guard it from prying eyes. Its halls echoed with the memories of better days, but now a sense of unease permeated the air. It started with little things. Missed items like keys and wallets would reappear in odd places. Furniture seemed to shift positions overnight. The elevator would stop at random floors, doors opening to empty hallways. These oddities were unsettling, but no one thought too much of them. Life went on, and people adjusted to the quirks of their aging home. Then, the disturbances grew more menacing. Noises in the night, a scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard, emanated from the basement. Soft, almost human moans floated up through the vents. The power would flicker, plunging the building into darkness for agonizing minutes at a time. Pets went missing, and strange claw marks appeared on the walls. The residents shared their stories with each other, huddled in the laundry room or the dimly lit lobby. Mrs. Gonzalez, the kind-hearted elderly woman from the third floor, was particularly vocal. She had lived in the building the longest and claimed to have heard something moving around at night. The younger residents laughed it off, attributing it to her age and overactive imagination. But then, Mrs. Gonzalez disappeared. Her absence was noticed immediately. She was the heart of the building, always ready with a warm smile and a plate of freshly baked cookies. When she didn't answer her door one morning, her neighbor Emily grew concerned. She alerted Jack, a young journalist who lived on the second floor and had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Jack and Emily entered Mrs. Gonzalez's apartment, their hearts pounding. The place was in disarray, furniture overturned, books scattered, a broken vase on the floor. Her beloved cat, Whiskers, was hiding under the bed, hissing and terrified. It was clear something terrible had happened. Panicked, Emily ran to Mr. Thompson's office. Mr. Thompson, the building's owner and manager, was a gruff, no-nonsense man in his 60s. He dismissed their concerns, insisting that Mrs. Gonzalez must have wandered off or had an accident. But Jack and Emily were not convinced. They knew Mrs. Gonzalez would never leave Whiskers behind. That night, the residents held a meeting in the lobby. Fear and frustration were palpable. They shared their experiences, and a pattern emerged. All the disturbances seemed to originate from the basement. Few had ever ventured down there. It was locked and labeled storage. The door was old and rusted, the kind that creaked ominously when opened. Jack, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, proposed they confront Mr. Thompson and demand access to the basement. Sarah, a brave schoolteacher who had moved in recently, and Tom, a retired cop with a sharp eye and steady nerves, volunteered to join him. The three of them approached Mr. Thompson's office with a mix of determination and dread. Mr. Thompson's office was cluttered with paperwork and old furniture, a testament to the building's long history. He looked up from his desk, irritated. "What now?" he grumbled. Jack took a deep breath. "Mr. Thompson, we need to see the basement. There's something down there, and it's putting us all in danger." Mr. Thompson's face paled. He fidgeted with a pen, avoiding their eyes. "There's nothing down there but old junk. You're letting your imaginations run wild." "Then why not let us check it out?" Sarah countered. "If there's nothing there, we'll leave it alone. But Mrs. Gonzalez is missing, and we need to find her." Tom stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, sir, We're not asking. We're telling. We need to see the basement. Reluctantly, Mr. Thompson reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a set of keys. His hand shook slightly as he handed them over. Fine, but I warned you there's nothing down there. With the keys in hand, Jack, Sarah, Tom, and a few other residents headed to the basement door. The air grew colder as they descended the stairs, a musty smell of dampness and decay growing stronger. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the tension was thick. Jack inserted the key into the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. It looked like any other basement, but the uneasy feeling in their stomachs told them otherwise. As they moved further in, they noticed a heavy, rusted door partially concealed behind a stack of boxes. It was different from the rest, more imposing and sinister. Tom, using his strength, managed to pry it open, revealing a dark corridor leading further underground. The air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding enveloped them. With flashlights in hand, they ventured into the unknown, their fears growing with each step. They had no idea what awaited them, but they knew they had to find out, for Mrs. Gonzalez and for their own safety. The narrow corridor beyond the rusted door was a stark contrast to the cluttered basement. The walls, previously rough concrete, transitioned to a cold, smooth metallic finish. An ominous hum seemed to reverberate through the air, as if the very walls were alive. Jack led the way, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Sarah and Tom followed closely, their senses on high alert. Their footsteps echoed eerily, amplifying the silence around them. The air was damp and musty, tinged with the metallic scent of old machinery. They passed several doors, all locked and sealed tight, with labels such as lab equipment and chemical storage. Each step deeper into the underground labyrinth heightened their anxiety. As they rounded a corner, the corridor opened into a vast room. The ceiling was high, and the walls were lined with shelves full of ancient scientific equipment, long abandoned and covered in a thick layer of dust. At the center of the room stood a large, reinforced glass chamber, illuminated by a faint, eerie green glow from within. The group halted in their tracks, their eyes fixed on the grotesque figure inside. The creature was humanoid but twisted and malformed. Its skin was pallid and stretched tight over a skeletal frame, with grotesquely elongated limbs that ended in sharp claw-like fingers. Its face, once human, was now a mask of agony and rage, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of yellow. Despite its monstrous appearance, there was a lingering trace of humanity in its features, a haunting reminder that this creature had once been a person. Jack approached a nearby table cluttered with dusty papers and old journals. He picked up the topmost journal, its cover brittle and cracked. The name Dr. Victor Leclerc was inscribed on the first page, and the entries were dated from over a decade ago. As Jack skimmed through the entries, he began to piece together a chilling story. Dr. Leclerc had been a brilliant but controversial scientist, obsessed with the idea of enhancing human capabilities. His research had been funded by a private organization with deep pockets and darker intentions. The lab beneath Evergreen Apartments had been his secret workspace, hidden from the prying eyes of the outside world. According to the journal, Dr. Leclerc had been conducting experiments on willing subjects, promising them improved strength, intelligence, and longevity. But as the experiments progressed, things began to go horribly wrong. The serum he developed had unpredictable and often horrifying side effects. The final entry revealed the identity of his last subject, a young man named Lucas, who had been one of the building's maintenance workers. Jack read aloud, his voice trembling. Lucas was a promising subject, strong and healthy. The initial results were promising, but soon his body began to reject the serum. His transformation was rapid and catastrophic. I have tried everything to reverse the effects, but nothing works. He is now more beast than man, driven by an insatiable rage. I have no choice but to contain him here, in the hopes that I can find a cure before it's too late. Sarah's eyes widened in horror. Lucas. He must have been trapped down here for years. No wonder we've been hearing those sounds. He's been trying to get out. Just as the gravity of their discovery sank in, a low, guttural growl emanated from the chamber. The creature, Lucas, was waking up. Its eyes snapped open, locking onto the intruders. The reinforced glass began to crack under the pressure of its thrashing, the sound piercing the tense silence. "Everyone, back away slowly," Tom instructed, his voice calm but firm. "We need to figure out a way to contain it before it breaks free." The group scrambled to find something to reinforce the chamber, but the room offered little in terms of useful materials. Tom's eyes scanned the area, landing on a control panel near the far wall. He rushed over, hoping to find a way to activate any remaining containment protocols. With Sarah's help, Tom managed to power up the control panel. The old machinery whirred to life, the lights flickering as the system struggled to operate. Tom's fingers flew over the buttons, trying to decipher the outdated interface. Finally, he found what he was looking for: a secondary containment system designed to reinforce the primary chamber. Heavy metal bars descended from the ceiling, locking into place around the glass chamber. Lucas roared in frustration, the sound reverberating through the room and sending chills down their spines. The reinforced bars held, but it was clear they wouldn't last long against the creature's relentless assault. Jack turned back to the journals, flipping through the pages in a desperate search for answers. There has to be something here. Something about an antidote or a way to reverse the transformation. Sarah joined him, scanning the handwritten notes and diagrams. "Look here," she said, pointing to a page detailing the serum's composition. Dr. Leclerc was working on an antidote. He believed it was possible to reverse the effects, but he didn't have enough time to complete it. "Then we need to finish what he started," Jack replied, determination in his eyes. "We need to find the ingredients and create the antidote. It's our only chance." Tom glanced at the thrashing creature, the reinforced bars already beginning to buckle. "We don't have much time. We need to move fast." With a renewed sense of urgency, the group split up to search the lab for the necessary components. The clock was ticking, and the fate of everyone in Evergreen Apartments hinged on their success. The basement lab was a maze of forgotten science and abandoned hope. Jack, Sarah, Tom, and the other residents scattered in different directions, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Dust particles danced in the beams, adding to the surreal atmosphere. The growls and roars from Lucas, the creature once human, echoed through the cavernous space, spurring them into frantic action. Jack and Sarah focused on the journals and scattered papers, hoping to find more detailed notes on the antidote. Tom, drawing on his cop instincts, took charge of organizing the search, directing the residents to look for specific chemicals and equipment. The tension was palpable. They all knew time was running out. Jack found a stack of notes with detailed chemical formulas. "Here," he called out to Sarah, who was rifling through a drawer of old syringes and vials. "This looks like Dr. Leclerc's work on the antidote. We need to find these compounds." Sarah scanned the list, her background in teaching giving her a methodical approach to problem solving. "Okay, we need to find sodium thiopental, calcium chloride, and several others. Let's split up and see if we can locate them." Tom assigned residents to different areas of the lab. Emily and Marcus, a young couple from the 4th floor, were tasked with searching the chemical storage room. Mr. Thompson, now visibly shaken but determined to help, was sent to check the refrigeration units for any preserved samples. As they searched, the lab seemed to come alive with memories of its dark past. Broken beakers and cracked test tubes littered the counters, and faded photographs of test subjects were pinned to bulletin boards. The faces in the photos were hauntingly human, a stark contrast to the monstrous form of Lucas thrashing in the reinforced chamber. Emily and Marcus found the chemical storage room locked, but with Tom's assistance, they managed to force the door open. Inside, shelves lined with dusty bottles and containers stretched out before them. Emily scanned the labels, calling out the names of the compounds they needed. Marcus grabbed each one and placed them in a metal tray. "We've got sodium thiopental and calcium chloride," Emily shouted back to Tom. "We're still looking for the others." Mr. Thompson, rummaging through the refrigeration units, found several vials labeled with the familiar handwriting of Dr. Leclerc. He carefully carried them back to the central table where Jack and Sarah were working. "These look like they might be what you're looking for," he said, placing the vials down gently. Jack and Sarah examined the vials, comparing them to the notes. "Yes, these are it," Sarah confirmed. "But we're still missing a few key ingredients." Tom's voice boomed across the lab. "Everyone, focus on finding these last few chemicals. We need to hurry." As they continued their desperate search, Lucas's growls grew louder, more ferocious. The reinforced bars were beginning to bend under the creature's relentless assault. The residents could feel the floor tremble with each impact, and fear gripped their hearts. Finally, with a triumphant shout, Emily found the remaining chemicals. She and Marcus rushed them over to Jack and Sarah, who immediately set to work. Using an old but functional Bunsen burner and a set of scales, they began to mix the ingredients, following Dr. Leclerc's notes meticulously. The process was delicate and precise. Each drop of liquid and pinch of powder had to be measured perfectly. The room fell into a tense silence, the only sounds being the bubbling of chemicals and the distant roars of Lucas. The residents watched anxiously, knowing that their lives depended on the success of this antidote. Minutes felt like hours as Jack and Sarah worked, their hands steady, but their hearts racing. Sweat trickled down their brows as they carefully combined the final components. At last, they produced a syringe filled with a clear, shimmering liquid, the antidote.
Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "We can use the old lab equipment to create a diversion. Something loud and flashy to draw its attention." The residents sprang into action, setting up a makeshift distraction using an old generator and some flammable chemicals. As the plan came together, Tom prepared the syringe, his grip firm and resolute. They all knew this was a one-shot deal. Failure was not an option. With everything in place, Tom signaled for the distraction to be activated. The generator roared to life, sparking and emitting a blinding light. Lucas, enraged by the noise and light, turned its attention away from the group. Taking advantage of the moment, Tom moved swiftly and decisively. He approached the creature with the syringe ready, dodging its flailing limbs. The reinforced bars provided some protection, but he knew he had to be quick. With a well-timed lunge, Tom jabbed the needle into Lucas's arm and injected the antidote. The creature roared in pain and fury, its body convulsing violently. Tom retreated quickly, joining the others as they watched in horrified anticipation. Lucas's monstrous form began to twitch and spasm, the antidote working its way through his system. The transformation was slow and agonizing to witness. Gradually, the grotesque features started to recede, the elongated limbs shrinking back to human proportions. As the creature's thrashing subsided, it collapsed onto the floor of the chamber, breathing heavily. The residents held their breath, waiting to see if the antidote had truly worked. Moments later, Lucas's eyes fluttered open, no longer glowing with unnatural light, but filled with confusion and fear. He was human once more, but the trauma of his ordeal was evident. The residents, though relieved, were haunted by the realization of what had been done to him. Lucas was taken to a hospital for treatment, but the memories of the lab and the monster beneath evergreen apartments would stay with them forever. The residents vowed to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. They destroyed the remaining serum and equipment, sealing the basement and its dark secrets. Though they emerged from the ordeal stronger and more united, the experience left an indelible mark on their souls. They had faced a nightmare and survived, but the memory of the monster beneath would haunt them forever. The relief in evergreen apartments was palpable, but it was laced with a profound sense of unease. Lucas, now human again, was taken to the hospital under Tom's watchful eye. The residents, though united in their ordeal, were left grappling with the aftermath of their terrifying discovery. Days passed, and life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The residents held a meeting in the lobby, this time to discuss the future of the building. Mr. Thompson, visibly shaken by the events, took the floor. "We can't let this happen again," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to seal the basement permanently and ensure no one ever tampers with the remnants of Dr. Leclerc's experiments." The residents agreed, but Jack had a nagging feeling that their ordeal was not entirely over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, he decided to dig deeper into the history of the building and Dr. Leclerc's experiments. Jack spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. He discovered that Dr. Victor Leclerc had been a renowned scientist before his fall from grace. His research had initially focused on curing diseases, but his ambition had driven him to explore more dangerous and unethical avenues. The funding for his experiments had come from a shadowy organization with deep pockets and a vested interest in his work. As Jack delved further, he uncovered a series of articles about mysterious disappearances in the area, dating back to the time when Dr. Leclerc had been conducting his experiments. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The missing persons had likely been test subjects, lured by promises of miraculous cures and enhancements. Driven by a sense of justice and a desire to uncover the full truth,
Jack decided to confront Mr. Thompson. He knocked on the door of the manager's office, which was now a mess of paperwork and old furniture, a testament to the building's troubled history. "Mr. Thompson, we need to talk," Jack said firmly. Mr. Thompson looked up from his desk, exhaustion etched on his face. "What is it now, Jack? Haven't we been through enough?" Jack placed the documents he had found on the desk. "I think there's more to this story. Dr. Leclerc's experiments, the funding from that organization, the disappearances. We need to know everything if we're going to move forward."
Mr. Thompson sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. "I suppose you have a right to know, but it's not a pretty story." He began to recount the history of Evergreen Apartments and Dr. Leclerc's experiments. Mr. Thompson had inherited the building from his father, who had been a business partner of Dr. Leclerc. They had seen the potential in Leclerc's work and had invested heavily in his research. When the experiments began to fail and the side effects became apparent, they had tried to cover it up to protect their investment and reputation. "We thought we could control it," Mr. Thompson admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "We were wrong. Lucas was the last straw. After his transformation, we shut everything down and tried to bury the past. But it seems you can't escape your sins." Jack listened intently, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "We need to make sure the truth comes out, and we need to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I agree. I'll help you in any way I can." Together, they compiled a comprehensive report detailing Dr. Leclerc's experiments, the funding, and the cover-up. They decided to hand it over to the authorities and the media, hoping that exposing the truth would bring some measure of justice to the victims and prevent future atrocities. As they worked, Jack received a call from Tom. "You need to get to the hospital. Lucas is awake and he's asking for you." Jack hurried to the hospital, his heart pounding. He found Lucas in a private room, looking frail but conscious. Tom stood by his side, a reassuring presence. "Jack," Lucas whispered, his voice weak. "Thank you for saving me." "We're not done yet, Lucas," Jack replied, taking a seat beside him. "We need your help. Do you remember anything from the time you were changed? Anything that might help us understand what happened?" Lucas closed his eyes as if searching his memory. "I remember pain, so much pain, and anger. But there were moments of clarity. I heard voices, commands. They wanted me to be a weapon." Jack's blood ran cold. "A weapon? For who?" "I don't know," Lucas said, shaking his head. "But there were others, more like me, hidden away." The revelation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. There were more victims out there, more people suffering like Lucas had. The organization behind Dr. Leclerc's experiments hadn't stopped. They had simply moved their operations elsewhere. Jack and Tom shared a determined look. "We need to find them," Jack said. "We need to stop this once and for all." The journey to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy had only just begun. The residents of Evergreen Apartments had faced a nightmare and survived, but their fight for justice and truth was far from over. United by their ordeal, they vowed to bring the shadowy organization to light and put an end to the horrors that had begun beneath their home. As they left the hospital, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. The monster beneath had been revealed, but the true battle was just beginning. Together, they would ensure that the past was never forgotten and that no one else would suffer the same fate. The storm had been relentless, its fury battering the rescue vessel as it navigated the treacherous waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Captain Daniels, a seasoned sailor with decades of experience, gripped the wheel with determination. The wind howled, and rain pounded against the windows of the bridge, obscuring the crew's vision. The radio crackled with static, and the distress signal that had led them into the heart of the storm continued to echo through the cabin. "Captain, I've got something on radar," First Mate Collins shouted over the roar of the storm. He pointed to the screen where a large stationary object appeared. "It's a ship, sir, and it's not responding to our hails." Captain Daniels squinted through the rain-splattered glass, trying to make out the shape in the distance. As lightning illuminated the sky, the silhouette of a massive cargo vessel emerged from the darkness. The ship was adrift, its ghostly outline contrasting sharply with the turbulent sea. "Prepare to board," Captain Daniels ordered, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The crew of 6 readied themselves, donning rain gear and securing ropes. The rescue vessel cautiously approached the derelict ship, the name Atlantic Voyager, becoming visible on its rusted hull. It was an old cargo vessel, its exterior marred by years of exposure to the elements. As they pulled alongside the Atlantic Voyager, the rescue team noticed an eerie silence. There were no signs of life, no movement on the deck. The ship's gangway hung loosely, swaying with the motion of the sea. Captain Daniels led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he climbed aboard, followed closely by First Mate Collins, Engineer Harris, Medic Dr. Morgan, and deckhands Ryan and Alex. Once on deck, the team fanned out, their flashlights casting long shadows on the wet, slick surfaces. The air was thick with an unexplainable sense of dread, and the ship creaked ominously as if protesting their presence. They found signs of a struggle. Overturned crates, scattered belongings, and ominous dark stains on the deck that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "What happened here?" Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at him. Dr. Morgan, ever the skeptic, knelt beside one of the stains. "Blood," she confirmed, her tone clinical. "But it's old. Whatever happened, it wasn't recent." Captain Daniels nodded grimly. "We need to find the ship's log and any other clues that can tell us what happened to the crew." The team split into pairs to cover more ground. Collins and Ryan took the upper decks, exploring the bridge and crew quarters. Captain Daniels and Alex headed for the cargo hold, while Harris and Dr. Morgan made their way to the engine room. Collins and Ryan climbed the stairs to the bridge, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The bridge was a chaotic mess, with charts and navigational tools strewn about. The logbook lay open on the captain's desk, its pages smeared with ink, and the final entry a frantic, illegible scrawl. "Looks like they were in a hurry," Collins observed, picking up the logbook. "But why?" Ryan, his nerves on edge, peered out the window at the dark sea. "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about this place." Meanwhile, Captain Daniels and Alex descended into the cargo hold, their flashlights revealing rows of crates stacked haphazardly. The cargo hold was cavernous, the smell of salt and decay hanging in the air, they found the ship's main cargo, crates filled with artifacts from an archaeological dig, their ancient origins betrayed by the dust and cobwebs that clung to them. Some of the crates were broken open, and the relics inside, statues, pottery, and other items, were scattered across the floor. "What are these?" Alex asked, picking up a small, intricately carved idol. "These look valuable." Captain Daniels frowned. "Artifacts. But why would a cargo ship be carrying these?" In the engine room, Harris and Dr. Morgan faced a different kind of mystery. The machinery was intact, but had been deliberately sabotaged. Harris inspected the damage, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Someone didn't want this ship to go anywhere," he concluded. Dr. Morgan, standing guard, felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced around nervously, convinced she had seen a shadow move out of the corner of her eye. "Harris, do you hear that?" she whispered. Harris paused, listening. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the metal corridors, but there was no one else around. "Yeah," he said, his voice tense. "We're not alone." As night fell, the team reconvened in the ship's mess hall, sharing their findings. The unsettling silence of the Atlantic Voyager was now filled with whispers and fleeting apparitions, as if the very air was alive with restless spirits. The rescue team couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the ship itself was aware of their presence. Captain Daniels spread out the logbook and other documents they had found on the table. "Something happened to this crew," he said, his voice low. "And whatever it wasn't natural. We need to be careful. This ship is hiding something, and we need to find out what." The team nodded in agreement, their resolve hardening despite the growing fear. They were trapped on a ghost ship, and its secrets were beginning to reveal themselves. Little did they know, their presence had awakened something ancient and malevolent, and their night of discovery was only just beginning. First, Mate Collins and Ryan took the upper decks, beginning their exploration with the bridge and crew quarters. The bridge was a chaotic mess, with charts, navigational tools, and personal belongings strewn about. Dust covered every surface, indicating that the ship had been abandoned for some time. Collins picked up the ship's logbook, which lay open on the captain's desk. The final entries were a desperate, frantic scrawl, detailing the crew's increasing paranoia and fear. "It's like they went mad," Collins murmured, flipping through the pages. "They talk about seeing things, hearing whispers." Ryan, standing by the bridge's large windows, stared out into the darkness. The storm had passed, leaving a thick fog in its wake. "Maybe they weren't just imagining things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep feeling like we're being watched." As they continued their search, they heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. They called out, but no one responded. The sound grew louder, closer, and then suddenly stopped. Ryan shone his flashlight down the hallway, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Let's keep moving," Collins said, trying to maintain his composure. "We need to check the crew quarters." The crew quarters were equally disarrayed. Bunk beds were overturned, personal effects scattered across the floor. They found more signs of a struggle, scratches on the walls, bloodstains, and broken furniture. As they searched the rooms, they began to see fleeting apparitions, ghostly figures of crew members, their faces twisted in anguish. "Did you see that?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. He pointed to a shadowy figure that had just disappeared around a corner. Collins nodded, his face pale. "Let's stay together. We need to find out what happened here." Meanwhile, Captain Daniels and Alex ventured into the cargo hold. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and their flashlights revealed rows of crates stacked haphazardly. The main cargo consisted of artifacts from an archaeological dig, their ancient origins betrayed by the dust and cobwebs that clung to them. Some crates were broken open, and the relics inside, statues, pottery, and other items, were scattered across the floor. "These look like they're from some ancient civilization," Alex said, examining a small, intricately carved idol. "Why would a cargo ship be carrying these?" Captain Daniels frowned, picking up an old journal that lay amid the debris. "Artifacts like these usually belong in a museum, not on a cargo ship. There's something we're missing." As they continued to explore the cargo hold, they felt an oppressive presence. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Captain Daniels glanced at Alex, who was visibly shaking. "Stay close," he instructed. "We don't know what's down here." In the engine room, Harris and Dr. Morgan were facing their own mysteries. The machinery, although intact, had been deliberately sabotaged. Wires were cut, gears jammed, and fuel lines severed. Harris inspected the damage, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Someone didn't want this ship to go anywhere," he concluded. "This was done intentionally." Dr. Morgan, standing guard, felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced around nervously, convinced she had seen a shadow move out of the corner of her eye. "Harris, do you hear that?" she whispered. Harris paused, listening. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the metal corridors, but there was no one else around. "Yeah," he said, his voice tense. "We're not alone." As they worked to understand the sabotage, the temperature in the engine room plummeted. Their breath formed misty clouds in the cold air. Harris felt a tap on his shoulder and turned quickly, expecting to see Dr. Morgan. Instead, he saw the translucent figure of a crew member, his eyes wide with terror. "Dr. Morgan, look!" Harris exclaimed, pointing at the apparition. But as soon as she turned, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the lingering chill. "We need to regroup with the others," Dr. Morgan said, her skepticism giving way to fear. "Something is very wrong here." As night fell, the encounters grew more frequent and terrifying. Collins and Ryan continued to hear whispers and see fleeting apparitions of crew members, their faces twisted in anguish. In the cargo hold, Captain Daniels and Alex felt the oppressive presence intensify, as if the relics themselves were alive. Harris and Dr. Morgan were haunted by the sound of machinery turning on and off by itself, as if manipulated by unseen hands. The spirits of the crew were restless, trapped between the living and the dead. They began to appear more frequently, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames. They whispered of betrayal, of a curse brought on board by the artifacts, and of their desire to escape their eternal torment. The rescue team regrouped in the ship's mess hall, sharing their experiences. Captain Daniels, his face pale and drawn, revealed the journal he had found in the captain's quarters. The journal belonged to Captain Harris of the Atlantic Voyager and detailed a harrowing tale of the ship's final days. According to the journal, the crew had discovered the artifacts during a routine cargo run. Among the relics was an ancient idol said to be cursed. Soon after bringing the idol on board, strange and terrifying events began to unfold. Crew members reported nightmares, hallucinations, and an overwhelming sense of dread. The journal entries became increasingly erratic, detailing the crew's descent into madness and paranoia. Captain Harris wrote of a mutiny, driven by fear and desperation. The crew turned on each other, believing the idol to be the source of their torment. The final entry was a frantic plea for help, as Captain Harris realized the true nature of the curse. The spirits of those who died on the ship were bound to it, unable to move on to the afterlife. The rescue team realized they were dealing with a powerful and malevolent force. They knew they had to find the cursed idol and remove it from the ship if they had any hope of escaping. But the spirits were growing more aggressive, their desperation palpable. They didn't want to harm the rescue team. They wanted to be freed. The team decided to split up once more to locate the idol. Armed with newfound determination and a growing sense of dread, they ventured into the ship's darkest corners. The spirits guided them, their whispers growing louder and more urgent. The Atlantic Voyager's true horror was beginning to reveal itself, and the rescue team was caught in a struggle between life and death. Determined to uncover the truth, the rescue team regrouped in the ship's mess hall, their faces drawn and eyes wide with fear. The room was dimly lit by flickering lanterns, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension as Captain Daniel spread out the journal and other documents they had found on a battered table. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "We've got to figure out what happened here and how to stop it. The ship's log and this journal give us some clues." He opened the journal, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was frantic and nearly illegible towards the end. "This journal belonged to Captain Harris," Daniels continued. "It tells the story of the Atlantic Voyager's final days. The crew found these artifacts during a cargo run, including an ancient idol believed to be cursed." Dr. Morgan leaned in, her scientific skepticism wavering in the face of mounting evidence. "Cursed? Like some kind of superstition?" "Not just superstition," Daniels replied, shaking his head. "The journal describes how the crew started experiencing nightmares, hallucinations, and a pervasive sense of dread after bringing the idol on board. They believed the idol was the source of their torment." He pointed to a particularly erratic entry, the ink smudged and the handwriting shaky. "This entry talks about a mutiny. The crew turned on each other, driven mad by fear. Captain Harris realized too late that the idol was cursed, and that the spirits of those who died on the ship were bound to it, unable to move on to the afterlife." The room fell silent as the team absorbed the gravity of the situation. The spirits of the crew had been trapped on the Atlantic Voyager for years, tormented by the curse they had unwittingly unleashed. The rescue team realized they were dealing with a powerful and malevolent force, and their own lives were now in grave danger. "We need to find that idol," Daniel said, his voice resolute. "It's the key to all of this. If we can remove it from the ship, maybe we can break the curse and free the spirits." "But where do we even start?" Ryan asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "This ship is massive, and it's like a maze down there." "The spirits are trying to communicate with us," Dr. Morgan interjected. "They've been guiding us, showing us glimpses of what happened. We need to pay attention to the signs." Harris nodded in agreement. In the engine room, I saw a shadowy figure pointing towards the cargo hold. Maybe that's where we'll find the idol. With renewed determination, the team split up once more to search the ship. Captain Daniels and Alex headed for the cargo hold, while Collins and Ryan took the upper decks, and Harris and Dr. Morgan returned to the engine room to look for more clues. Captain Daniels and Alex descended into the cargo hold, their flashlights piercing the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and the oppressive sense of dread grew stronger with each step. They moved cautiously, aware that the spirits were watching them. As they navigated the labyrinthine corridors, they heard whispers growing louder, guiding them towards a particular section of the hold. The crates here were different, older, more worn. They found a large crate, its lid ajar, and inside it, the idol. The idol was grotesque, carved from dark, polished stone. Its eyes seemed to glint with a malevolent light, and a sense of malevolence emanated from it. Captain Daniels reached out to touch it, but the air around it grew colder, and the spirits of the crew appeared, their forms more solid and terrifying than before. "Captain Harris," Daniels whispered, recognizing the ghostly figure at the forefront. The spirit's eyes were filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "You must destroy it," the ghostly captain intoned, his voice echoing with the pain of countless souls. "It binds us here. Free us from this torment." Meanwhile, on the upper decks, Collins and Ryan faced their own horrors. As they searched the crew quarters for more clues, they were confronted by the ghosts of crew members, their faces twisted in agony. The apparitions grew more aggressive, lashing out in desperation. Ryan stumbled backwards, his flashlight flickering. "We need to get out of here," he yelled, panic rising in his voice. "No," Collins replied firmly, grabbing Ryan's arm. "We need to find that idol and help Captain Daniels. It's the only way to stop this." In the engine room, Harris and Dr. Morgan uncovered more evidence of the crew's desperation. They found tools and parts scattered around, as if someone had been trying to repair the damage in a hurry. The machinery creaked and groaned, and they felt the presence of the spirits all around them. "Harris, over here!" Dr. Morgan called, pointing to a makeshift shrine in a corner. It was adorned with trinkets and mementos, offerings from the crew to appease the spirits. At the center was a small carved stone, similar in style to the idol in the cargo hold. "This must be connected to the curse," Harris said, examining the stone. The crew was trying to protect themselves. As they stood up, the temperature dropped further, and the spirit of an engineer appeared before them, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Help us," the ghostly figure pleaded. "Free us from this nightmare." Back in the cargo hold, Captain Daniels and Alex faced the final confrontation. The spirits of the crew surrounded them, their forms flickering like candle flames. The air crackled with energy as Daniels raised the idol above his head. "We're going to end this," Daniels declared, his voice unwavering. With all his strength, he brought the idol down on the metal floor, shattering it into pieces. A wave of energy surged through the ship, knocking them off their feet. The spirits cried out, their forms dissolving into the ether. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and a sense of peace washed over the Atlantic Voyager. The team, battered but alive, regrouped on the deck. The ship was now devoid of its ghostly inhabitants, its secrets finally laid to rest. Captain Daniels signaled for their rescue vessel, knowing they had succeeded in their mission. As they sailed away, the team couldn't shake the feeling that they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had confronted the supernatural and emerged victorious. But the memory of the ghostly crew, their tortured souls now at peace, would stay with them forever. The Atlantic Voyager drifted into the distance, a silent sentinel of the ocean, its secrets finally at rest. The rescue team knew they had not only saved themselves, but also freed the spirits from eternal torment. Their encounter with the ghost ship would remain a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The team stood on the deck of the Atlantic Voyager, the tension slowly ebbing away. The air was clear, the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the ship now gone. The spirits were at peace, their tormented cries silenced. Captain Daniels surveyed his crew, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. They had survived a night of terror, but the experience had left an indelible mark on each of them. "Let's get back to our vessel," Daniels said, his voice steady but tired. "We need to report what happened here." The rescue team climbed down the gangway and boarded their rescue vessel, grateful to be leaving the ghost ship behind. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, casting a soft glow over the ocean. As they pulled away, the Atlantic Voyager loomed in the distance, its secrets finally laid to rest. On the rescue vessel, the team gathered in the small cabin, the adrenaline of the night giving way to exhaustion. Dr. Morgan began tending to minor injuries, while Harris worked on repairing the damaged radio to send a distress signal. "We need to document everything," Collins said, opening his notebook. "No one's going to believe this unless we have a detailed report." Ryan, still shaken, nodded. "I saw things I can't explain. I never believed in ghosts, but now, I don't know." Captain Daniels sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. "We've all seen things tonight that defy explanation, but we have to make sure the authorities know what happened here. The Atlantic Voyager needs to be properly investigated." As the rescue vessel navigated the calm waters, they managed to get the radio working. Harris sent out a distress signal, and within hours they were met by a Coast Guard ship. The team was taken aboard, where they gave their accounts of the night's events to the commanding officer. "We encountered something beyond our understanding," Captain Daniels said, his voice firm despite the fatigue. "The Atlantic Voyager was cursed by an ancient idol, and the spirits of the crew were trapped on the ship. We destroyed the idol, and the spirits were freed." The commanding officer listened intently, his expression serious. "We'll send a team to investigate the Atlantic Voyager. Your reports will be crucial in understanding what happened." Back on land, the rescue team was debriefed and given medical examinations. They were hailed as heroes for their bravery, but each member knew that the true horror of the night would stay with them forever. They returned to their respective lives, trying to find normalcy after such a harrowing experience. Weeks later, Captain Daniels received a letter from the Coast Guard. The investigation of the Atlantic Voyager had confirmed the presence of the artifacts and the sabotage in the engine room. However, there was no sign of the spirits or the supernatural occurrences described by the rescue team. The authorities were skeptical, but could not ignore the evidence of the crew's tragic fate. Daniels gathered his team to share the news. They met at a small diner near the docks, a place they frequented before the rescue mission that had changed their lives. "The investigation confirmed what we found," Daniel said, placing the letter on the table. "But they didn't encounter the spirits. They think it was all due to the psychological effects of the isolation and the artifact's history." Collins shook his head. "We know what we saw. We know the truth." Ryan, still haunted by the memories, added, "They may not believe us, but we did the right thing. We freed those souls." Dr. Morgan, who had always been the skeptic, nodded slowly. "I came into this as a scientist, but there are things in this world we can't explain. We have to accept that." As they sat together, they found solace in each other's company. They had faced the unknown and survived, their bond strengthened by the shared ordeal. The experience had changed them, but it had also brought them closer. The Atlantic Voyager remained adrift, a ghost ship in every sense of the word. Its story became a legend among sailors and coast guards, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath the surface of the sea. The rescue team knew that the spirits they had encountered were finally at peace, their torment ended by the destruction of the cursed idol. In the end, the rescue team continued their work, driven by a newfound understanding of the thin veil between the living and the dead. They carried with them the memory of the Atlantic Voyager, a reminder of the night they had faced the supernatural and emerged victorious. Their story would be told and retold, a testament to their courage and the enduring mystery of the ghost ship. Ethan Cole's truck rumbled down the narrow dirt road, the tires kicking up a trail of dust as it wound through the dense forest. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight, casting long, ominous shadows across the path. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. The GPS on his dashboard blinked and lost signal miles back, leaving him to rely on the outdated map he'd been given at the park headquarters. "Station 21, he muttered to himself, double-checking the map. It was the last stop on his route, a remote ranger outpost in the heart of Greystone National Park. Known for its ancient, towering trees and treacherous terrain, the park was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Ethan had been a park ranger for nearly a decade, and while he'd worked in some of the most isolated and rugged areas, nothing had prepared him for the unsettling feeling that crept over him as he neared Station 21. The radio crackled with static, the last trace of human contact fading away. He tapped it out of habit, but the noise only grew worse before cutting out entirely. He was alone now, just him and the forest. After what felt like hours, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing where Station 21 stood. The outpost was modest, a wooden cabin with a sagging roof and a weathered porch, flanked by an old lookout tower. A faded sign on the front read, "Station 21," in peeling letters. The place had seen better days. Ethan parked the truck and stepped out, the air cool and damp against his skin. The silence was overwhelming. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, not even the sound of a distant stream. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He shook off the uneasy feeling and grabbed his bags, walking up to the cabin. The door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the grime-covered windows. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A battered desk, a small kitchen area, a cot in the corner, and a radio set that looked as ancient as the building itself. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air had a musty smell like it hadn't been aired out in years. Ethan dropped his bags near the cot and surveyed the room. He noticed a stack of papers on the desk, topped with a folded note. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then you've taken over for me. I'm sorry. I didn't have time to explain everything before I left, and even if I did, you wouldn't believe me. Stay vigilant. This place, it's not like the others. Keep the doors locked at night. Don't go into the woods after dark, no matter what you hear. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. Good luck. You're going to need it." Mason. The name rang a bell. Mason Hadley was the previous ranger stationed at 21. He'd been here only a few months before, suddenly resigning without any explanation. Ethan had thought nothing of it at the time. Burnout was common in this line of work, especially in such remote locations. But now, with the ominous note in his hand, a chill ran down his spine. Ethan looked around the cabin again, noticing the small things he hadn't before. The way the furniture was slightly off-kilter, as if it had been moved hastily. The deep scratches on the wooden floor near the door, and the fact that the curtains were drawn tightly shut, even in the middle of the day. He set the note down and moved to the desk, rifling through the papers. Most of them were routine reports, but a few caught his attention. They were logs from Mason, detailing odd occurrences, missing hikers, strange sounds in the night, and sightings of something moving through the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. Each entry was more desperate than the last until they abruptly stopped. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd heard rumors about Station 21 before taking the assignment, stories about strange things in the woods, about how it was cursed or haunted. He dismissed them as campfire tales, the kind of stories passed around to scare the rookies. But now, standing in the cabin with the silence pressing in on him from all sides, he wasn't so sure. He decided to take a walk around the perimeter, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. Grabbing his hat and flashlight, he stepped outside. The late afternoon light was already fading, casting long shadows across the clearing. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches intertwined like the gnarled fingers of an old witch. Ethan walked the perimeter, noting the old, rusted traps set up around the station, probably to keep animals away, though they looked like they hadn't been checked in years. The woods were thick and dense, the kind of place where someone could easily get lost and never be found. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, feeling that same prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like he was being watched. As he neared the edge of the clearing, something caught his eye, a series of deep, claw-like marks gouged into the trunk of a tree. The marks were old, the bark grown over in places, but they were unmistakably the result of something large and powerful. He reached out to touch them, the bark rough under his fingers. What kind of animal had made these? And why here, so close to the station? A sudden rustling in the bushes made him spin around, his hand instinctively going to the flashlight on his belt. But there was nothing there. Just the wind, he told himself. Or maybe a deer. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. He made his way back to the cabin, a growing sense of unease settling over him. Inside, he locked the door behind him and turned on the old radio set, but all he got was static. He tried the satellite phone next, but the line was dead. Just great, he thought, isolated and cut off. Ethan sat down on the cot, pulling Mason's note from his pocket and reading it again. Stay vigilant. Don't go into the woods at night. Don't listen to the whispers. What had Mason meant by whispers? The phrase lingered in his mind as the light outside faded completely, leaving the cabin in darkness save for the weak glow of a single lantern. He was exhausted, but sleep seemed impossible with the weight of the note and the strange atmosphere pressing down on him. The first night at Station 21 stretched on endlessly. Every creak of the wooden walls, every gust of wind outside made Ethan tense, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could be out there in the dark. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew there was something more, something in the woods, something that had been watching him since the moment he arrived. He lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, Mason's final words echoing in his mind. Good luck. You're going to need it. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had driven Mason to leave in such a hurry was now watching him, waiting for its chance to make itself known. Ethan awoke to the sound of rain tapping against the cabin's tin roof, the steady rhythm both soothing and unsettling. He lay still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the grime-covered windows. The events of his first day at Station 21 replayed in his mind. The ominous note from Mason, the eerie silence, the claw marks on the tree. It had been a restless night filled with strange dreams that left him more exhausted than before. The radio remained silent, the satellite phone still dead. He had planned to contact headquarters first thing this morning. But without communication, he felt as though he was cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in this forgotten corner of the park. It didn't help that Station 21 felt more like a relic of the past than an operational outpost. Everything was worn, outdated, as if it had been abandoned long ago. Ethan pushed himself out of bed, splashed his face with cold water from the basin, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. He had a job to do. If he let every creak and shadow get to him, he'd never make it through the season. After a quick breakfast of canned beans and coffee, he checked his map. Today, he was scheduled to patrol the northern section of the park, a dense, hilly area that was notorious for its difficult terrain. He strapped on his gear, including the bear spray and hunting knife that now felt more essential than ever, and stepped out into the rain. The forest was shrouded in mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The undergrowth was thick and wet, making each step heavy and deliberate. As he walked, he kept his eyes on the ground, searching for any sign of the missing hiker. Though no one had filed an official report, a group of campers had mentioned seeing a man heading north on the main trail several days ago. Since then, there had been no trace of him. Ethan followed the trail as it wound through the woods, the rain growing heavier, obscuring the landscape. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches dripping with moisture, the ground beneath turning to mud. The mist hung thick and low, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. After an hour of walking, he came to a small clearing where the trail split into two. A faded sign pointed to a scenic overlook, But something else caught Ethan's attention. A set of footprints, barely visible in the soft earth, leading off the trail and into the trees. He crouched down to examine them, noting that they were fresh, likely made within the last day or so. The prints were deep, as if the person had been running, or perhaps struggling against the thick mud. But why would anyone veer off the main trail here, especially in this weather? His instincts told him to follow them. The footprints led him deeper into the forest, where the trees grew even denser, their branches entwining like twisted, gnarled fingers. The further he went, the more he noticed signs of a struggle. Broken branches, disturbed earth, patches of foliage that had been trampled flat. It was as if something had dragged the person through the woods, but there were no other tracks, no sign of an animal. Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The silence that had been unsettling before now felt oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He pressed on, the mist swirling around him, distorting shapes and sounds. Then he saw it. Just ahead, the ground was torn up in a wide circle, the dirt churned as if something had burrowed out of the earth. In the center lay a single, mud-splattered boot, half buried and abandoned. Ethan's stomach tightened as he knelt to pick it up. It was heavy, the laces frayed, the sole worn thin from years of use. But it was the dark, reddish stain on the side that made his heart race. Blood. A sudden rustling in the bushes made him whip around, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray. But there was nothing. Only the trees, the mist, and the rain. He scanned the area, his senses on high alert, but saw no movement, no sign of what had caused the disturbance. Still, the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of sight, was stronger than ever. He quickly radioed in his find, but as expected, the static greeted him in response. The idea of turning back crossed his mind, but he knew he couldn't leave without finding out what had happened. He had to keep going, despite the gnawing fear in his gut. Ethan moved cautiously now, every step calculated, his ears straining for any sound beyond the patter of rain. He continued to follow the trail of disturbed earth and broken branches, the sense of dread growing with each passing minute. The path eventually led him to a narrow ravine, its edges slick with mud. The footprints stopped at the edge, but there was something else. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were strange, intricate symbols. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, more akin to ancient runes than any modern writing. The lines were sharp and deliberate, almost as if they had been etched with a precise tool, not by natural forces or even an animal. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he traced the symbols with his finger, the bark cold and damp to the touch. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy, and as he stared at them, he could swear he heard a faint whisper, just on the edge of his perception, a soft, sibilant sound that sent shivers through his entire body. He stepped back, shaken. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something far more sinister was at work here, something that went beyond the realm of what he could easily explain. The symbols, the boot, the disturbed ground, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The hiker hadn't simply gotten lost, he had been taken. As Ethan turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from all directions at once. He froze, his pulse quickening. The growl was unlike anything he'd ever heard, deep, resonant, and filled with a primal anger that sent his instincts screaming to run. But he didn't run. He couldn't. If there was one thing he had learned from years of working in the wilderness, it was that running was the surest way to provoke a predator. Instead, he slowly backed away from the edge of the ravine, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the trees. Ethan could feel the vibrations in his chest, as if the sound itself was pressing down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. His mind raced as he tried to pinpoint the source, but the mist and the dense underbrush made it impossible. Then, in the periphery of his vision, he saw it, a large, shadowy figure moving through the trees, too indistinct to make out details, but unmistakably massive. It moved with a fluidity that was almost unnatural, its form shifting and undulating as it melted into the mist. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, watching in a mixture of terror and fascination as it circled the clearing, always staying just out of clear view. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, dissolving into the mist like a wraith. The growl faded into the distance, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to weigh on Ethan's shoulders. He exhaled shakily, realizing he had been holding his breath. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it was still out there, somewhere in the forest, watching him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ethan forced himself to turn and make his way back to Station 21. The forest seemed even darker and more foreboding than before, the mist thicker, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge, but he pushed on, refusing to look back. By the time he reached the cabin, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky was still a dull gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. Ethan slammed the door shut behind him, locking it for good measure. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing, his mind racing with what he had seen. He knew one thing for sure. The hiker wasn't coming back, and whatever had taken him was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Ethan glanced at Mason's note, still lying on the desk, and felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Mason had warned him to stay vigilant, to never go into the woods at night, but the warning had come too late. Ethan had already stepped into the darkness, and now there was no turning back. As he sank into the chair, exhaustion overtaking him, Ethan realized that Station 21 was far more than just a remote outpost. It was a trap, a place where something ancient and malevolent prowled the woods, and he was now caught in its sights. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it that low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the cabin. Ethan's hand tightened around the handle of his hunting knife, the only thing standing between him and whatever was out there. He knew he couldn't stay inside forever. Sooner or later, he would have to face whatever was watching him. And when that time came, he could only hope he'd be ready. But deep down, he knew the forest had other plans for him. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the forest shrouded in a thick, damp mist that clung to everything like a cold, wet blanket. Ethan sat at the small wooden table in the cabin, staring out the window at the creeping fog. His mind replayed the events of the previous day, The disappearance of the hiker, the strange symbols carved into the trees, and the haunting growl that had echoed through the woods. It was the kind of sound that burrowed deep into your bones and settled there, a lingering reminder that something was out there, something very much aware of him. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in on him, that the trees were somehow watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He'd spent the better part of the morning pacing the small cabin, trying to decide his next step. The rational part of his mind told him to stay put, to wait for backup, or at least for the radio to start working again. But he knew that waiting might not be an option. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer, and it wasn't going to wait for him to be ready. The memory of the shadowy figure in the forest haunted him, its form indistinct and shifting like smoke, yet undeniably massive. The way it had moved with a fluidity that defied the natural order was unlike anything he'd ever seen in his years as a ranger. And then there was the growl, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from all around him, reverberating through the trees and the very earth beneath his feet. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. He needed to know what he was dealing with. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, knife, and a flare gun from the supply closet, strapping them to his belt before heading out the door. The mist was thicker now, the air heavy with moisture, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees loomed like tall, silent sentinels, their branches interlocking to form a dense canopy overhead. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into another world, one where the rules of reality were bent and twisted, just like the trees themselves. He retraced his steps from the day before, following the same path he'd taken in search of the missing hiker. The forest seemed different today, the familiar landmarks obscured by the fog, the ground softer and more treacherous beneath his boots. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. But even those sounds felt muted, swallowed by the mist. As he walked, Ethan couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It was more than just paranoia. It was a visceral, gut-wrenching certainty that something was out there, tracking his every move. He stopped periodically, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that might indicate the presence of the shadowy figure. But the forest offered no clues, only an impenetrable wall of fog and silence. After what felt like hours, he reached the clearing where he'd found the hiker's boot and the strange symbols carved into the tree. The boot was still there, half buried in the mud, the bloodstain on its side now a dark, ominous reminder of what had happened. The symbols on the tree were just as he remembered them, sharp, intricate lines that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. Ethan knelt beside the tree, examining the symbols more closely. They were unlike any he'd seen before, not part of any language or code he could recognize. They seemed ancient, almost primal, as if they had been carved by something, or someone, that understood a language far older than humanity itself. A sudden rustling in the bushes behind him made him freeze. Slowly he turned, his hand going to the flashlight at his belt. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained to see through the fog, but the thick mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. He clicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the mist like a knife. The light revealed nothing but more trees, their gnarled trunks twisted and deformed. The forest was silent once more, the only sound his own breathing, loud and uneven in the stillness. And then he saw it, a shadowy figure moving between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch and contract as it moved. Its form was vague, as if it was made of the very mist that surrounded it, blending seamlessly into the fog. The flashlight beam flickered as it passed over the figure, the light seeming to waver and bend around it. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure paused as if it sensed the light and slowly turned toward him. For a moment they were locked in a silent standoff, the air thick with tension. The figure didn't move closer, but Ethan could feel its gaze on him, cold and calculating. It wasn't just watching him, it was studying him, assessing him like a predator does its prey. With a trembling hand, Ethan raised the flashlight higher, trying to get a better look at the figure's face. But the mist distorted everything, blurring the edges of the creature's form. All he could make out was a vague impression of something humanoid, but twisted and wrong, its features lost in shadow. Suddenly, the figure began to move again, its steps slow and deliberate, each one taking it closer to the edge of the clearing. Ethan's pulse quickened as he realized it was circling him, staying just out of the beam of his flashlight. It moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, gliding through the mist without making a sound. Ethan took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure continued its slow circle, closing in on him with each pass. His grip tightened on the flashlight, his other hand hovering near the flare gun at his belt. He had no idea what good it would do, but it was the only weapon he had. The figure paused again, just a few feet away from him now. Ethan could feel the air around him grow colder, as if the creature was drawing the heat out of the very atmosphere. His breath formed small clouds of vapor in front of him, each one hanging in the air like a silent scream. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at him, its form elongating, stretching out impossibly as it reached for him. Ethan barely had time to react. He stumbled backward, falling to the ground as the creature passed over him, its shadow enveloping him in darkness. He fumbled for the flare gun, his hands shaking as he aimed it at the figure. The creature paused, looming over him, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Ethan pulled the trigger and the flare shot out with a bright flash, filling the clearing with a blinding red light. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as the light struck it. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw something more. A glimpse of eyes, cold and malevolent, staring down at him from the shadow's depths. The flare hit the ground and sputtered out, the light fading as quickly as it had come. The figure vanished with it, dissolving into the mist like a wisp of smoke. Ethan scrambled to his feet, the flare gun clattering to the ground beside him. The clearing was empty again. The only sound his own ragged breathing. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart racing, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The fog began to lift, the sunlight piercing through in thin golden beams that seemed to chase away the shadows. But the fear remained, rooted deep within him like a dark seed. Ethan knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that whatever he had seen was no mere hallucination. The figure was real, and it was still out there, lurking in the forest, watching him. He could feel its presence lingering at the edge of his awareness, a constant, oppressive weight on his mind. With trembling hands, he picked up the flare gun and tucked it back into his belt. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving him feeling drained and weak. He needed to get back to the cabin, to regroup, to figure out what to do next. But as he turned to leave, his eyes caught on the symbols carved into the tree once more. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, as if reacting to the presence of the creature. Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him as he realized that the symbols weren't just random markings, they were a warning that he had ignored. He turned away from the tree and began to walk, his pace quickening as he made his way back through the forest. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward him, the mist closing in, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until he was safely back inside the cabin, with the door locked and the darkness kept at bay. But even then, Ethan knew that safety was an illusion. The figure had found him, and it wasn't going to stop until it had him. He was no longer just a park ranger doing his job. He was prey, and the hunt had only just begun. As he reached the clearing where the cabin stood, Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing there, watching him. But the forest was still, the mist beginning to dissipate in the warm afternoon sun. For a moment he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had imagined it all. But deep down, he knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. Ethan stepped inside the cabin and locked the door, leaning heavily against it as he tried to steady his breathing. The room was silent, the only sound the faint creak of the wooden walls. He felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on him, the realization that he was facing something far beyond his understanding. He sank into the chair at the table, his hands still trembling as he stared at the map spread out before him. The map that now felt useless, as if it couldn't possibly convey the true danger that lay hidden in these woods. Ethan knew he needed to think, to plan his next move carefully. But all he could focus on was the cold, hard truth that had settled in his mind. Whatever was out there, it was watching him, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of that same low, guttural growl that had haunted him since his arrival. Ethan closed his eyes, knowing that this was only the beginning. Ethan awoke the next morning to the sound of rain pattering softly against the cabin's roof, a dull gray light filtering through the windows. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like a persistent shadow, making it hard to distinguish between the remnants of his nightmares and the reality he had faced in the woods. The memory of the shadowy figure, the guttural growl, and the symbols carved into the trees haunted him, gnawing at his nerves. He sat at the small table, staring down at the map of the park, tracing his finger along the trail he had taken the day before. There was a time when this map had made sense to him, each trail and landmark a clear guide through the wilderness. But now, after everything he had seen, it felt incomplete, as though it only hinted at the darker, hidden layers of the forest that weren't marked on any chart. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes and causing the trees to sway. As Ethan sipped his coffee, he thought about the strange symbols he had found and the ancient malevolent presence that seemed to be connected to them. He needed answers, something more tangible than his own fear and suspicion. The name Mrs. Havisham came to mind, an elderly woman who lived just on the outskirts of the park. She was something of a local legend herself, known for her deep knowledge of the park's history and the old stories passed down through generations. Ethan had spoken to her briefly when he first arrived, and she had warned him to be careful in the woods. But he had brushed it off as the usual talk of superstitions. Now, he wasn't so sure. If anyone could shed light on the strange occurrences at Station 21, it would be her. Ethan finished his coffee, grabbed his jacket, and prepared to make the trek to Mrs. Havisham's cottage. The mist had cleared, but the sky remained overcast, the clouds heavy and dark. He strapped on his gear, making sure to bring his flashlight and flare gun, just in case, before stepping out into the damp morning air. The trail to Mrs. Havisham's cottage was well trodden, a narrow dirt path winding through the trees. The forest felt different today, not as oppressive as the day before, but still unsettling in its silence. The birds were quiet, the only sounds the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional gust of wind that sent a shiver through the trees. Ethan kept a wary eye on his surroundings, half expecting the shadowy figure to reappear at any moment. But the forest remained still, and after an hour of walking he arrived at a small clearing where Mrs. Havisham's cottage stood. It was a quaint, old building with a thatched roof and ivy creeping up the stone walls. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the scent of burning wood filled the air. He knocked on the wooden door, and after a moment it creaked open to reveal Mrs. Havisham, her sharp blue eyes peering up at him from beneath a tangle of silver hair. She was small and frail-looking, but there was a strength in her gaze that belied her age. "Ethan Cole," she said, her voice raspy but warm. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking. Come in before you let all the warmth out." Ethan stepped inside, the warmth of the cottage a welcome relief from the cold dampness outside. The interior was cozy with old wooden furniture, shelves lined with books, and a fire crackling in the hearth. The smell of herbs and something sweet, maybe freshly baked bread, lingered in the air. Mrs. Havisham motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table, where she had already set out a pot of tea and 2 cups. She poured them both a cup, her hands steady despite her age, and then sat down across from him, watching him with an expectant gaze. "I take it you're not here just for a social visit," she said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. Ethan nodded, his thoughts still clouded by the events of the previous days. "You could say that. Something strange has been happening out there. I've seen things I can't explain." Mrs. Havisham's expression grew serious, the smile fading. "The woods have always been strange, Ranger Cole. They were strange long before the park was established, long before the first settlers arrived. I found symbols carved into a tree," Ethan said, leaning forward. "And then I saw something that shouldn't exist. A figure, tall and dark, moving through the mist. It wasn't human, but it was watching me, tracking me." Mrs. Havisham's eyes narrowed as she listened, her hands clasped around her teacup. "You've seen the Watcher," she said quietly. "The spirit of the woods. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But seeing it and surviving to tell the tale, well, that's a rare thing." "The Watcher," Ethan echoed, the name sending a chill down his spine. "What is it? And what do those symbols mean?" Mrs. Havisham sighed, her gaze distant as she stared into the flames of the hearth. The Watcher is as old as the forest itself, maybe older. The stories say it was once a guardian, a protector of the land, long before people ever set foot here. But something changed. No one knows exactly what. Some say the settlers angered it when they cut down the sacred trees to build their homes. Others say it was a curse brought upon the land by those who sought to control it. She paused, her eyes darkening. The symbols you saw, they're part of an ancient language, one that's been lost to time. The settlers used it in their rituals, trying to appease the Watcher or bind it to their will. But the Watcher doesn't bow to anyone. Those symbols don't protect, they trap. They mark places where the Watcher's power is strongest, where it can reach into our world more easily. Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him as he listened. I've seen what it can do. There was a hiker. He's gone. And I found a boot with blood on it. Whatever this thing is, it's dangerous. Mrs. Havisham nodded solemnly. The Watcher doesn't take kindly to intruders. It sees the forest as its domain, and anyone who enters is fair game. It stalks them, studies them, and when the time is right, it strikes. The hiker you found, he's likely already been claimed. And if you're not careful, you could be next. Ethan's grip tightened around his teacup, the warmth doing little to ease the chill in his bones. Is there any way to stop it? To protect myself? Mrs. Havisham looked at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. There are ways to keep it at bay for a time. The settlers used to leave offerings at the base of certain trees, food, trinkets, things of value. They believed it would appease the Watcher, keep it satisfied, but it's not a permanent solution. The Watcher isn't a creature you can bargain with. It's something far older, far more powerful than anything we can truly understand. Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together everything she had told him. What about the cabin, the symbols carved into the trees nearby? Could they be keeping it away? Mrs. Havisham shook her head slowly. Those symbols might be giving you a false sense of security. The Watcher is drawn to them, not repelled by them. They're markers, reminders of the old ways, of the people who tried and failed to control it. Your cabin is likely in one of its favorite hunting grounds. Ethan's heart sank. So what do? I can't just leave, I have a job to do. Mrs. Havisham studied him for a long moment, her eyes piercing. If you're determined to stay, then you need to be prepared. The Watcher will come for you sooner or later. You must be vigilant, always aware of your surroundings. Don't go into the woods at night, and never, ever listen to the whispers. The whispers? Ethan asked, a sense of foreboding settling over him. The Watcher can't speak in words, but it can communicate in other ways, she explained. It can twist the sounds of the forest, make you hear things that aren't there. It will try to lure you into the trees, lead you deeper into its territory. Once you're in its grasp, there's no escaping. Ethan felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating realization that he was dealing with something far beyond his control. The Watcher wasn't just a figment of his imagination or some local legend. It was real, and it was out there, watching him, waiting for its chance to strike. Is there anything else I should know? He asked, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Havisham hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. There's one more thing. If you see it again, if it comes for you, don't run. Running will only make it more determined, more dangerous. Stand your ground, show no fear. It's said that the Watcher respects strength, that it may spare those who don't flee, but it's only a rumor. No one really knows what the Watcher wants or why it does what it does. Ethan nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation settling in. He had come to Station 21 thinking it would be just another assignment, another stretch of time spent in the solitude of the wilderness. But this was different. The forest wasn't just a place to be patrolled and protected. It was alive, and it had a dark, ancient force that was far beyond his understanding. He finished his tea, the warmth doing little to ease the cold fear that had taken hold of him. Mrs. Havisham reached across the table and placed a hand on his, her grip surprisingly firm. "You're a good man, Ethan Cole," she said softly, "but you're in over your head. Be careful, and don't let your pride lead you into a fight you can't win." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding again. "Thank you, Mrs. Havisham, for everything." She smiled sadly. "I'll pray for you, Ethan. You'll need all the help you can get." With that, he rose from the table, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. He thanked her again, and then stepped out into the cold, damp air, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The trail back to the cabin felt longer, the shadows deeper, the trees more menacing. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive with unseen eyes, that the Watcher was out there, just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. When he finally reached the cabin, he bolted the door behind him, his heart still pounding. The day had barely begun, but already it felt like he was running out of time. The Watcher was watching, waiting, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before their paths crossed again. He stared at the map spread out on the table, the symbols etched into the bark of the trees, now making a terrible kind of sense. The Watcher was real, and it was coming for him. And when it did, Ethan would be ready. He had to be, because out here in the depths of Greystone National Park, there were no second chances. Ethan woke with a start, the silence of the cabin broken only by the steady thrum of his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He lay still for a moment, listening. But the night remained quiet. No growls, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive quiet of a forest holding its breath. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:30 a.m. Too early to be awake, yet too late to go back to sleep. The events of the past few days had weighed heavily on him, and the conversation with Mrs. Havisham lingered in his mind. Her words a grim reminder of the ancient power that lurked just beyond the safety of the cabin walls. Ethan pushed himself out of bed and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. Everything looked peaceful, almost serene. But Ethan knew better. The forest had a way of hiding its true nature, masking the dangers that lurked within. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his fingers twisting the knob with increasing desperation. The radio crackled again, this time followed by a burst of what sounded like a faint voice, distant and garbled. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He adjusted the frequency, trying to lock onto the signal. For a brief moment, the static cleared, and a voice came through, distorted but recognizable. "Station 21. Ethan Cole, can you hear me? He leaned in, almost pressing his ear to the speaker. Yes, I can hear you. This is Ethan Cole at Station 21. Can you hear me? The voice crackled, breaking apart into fragments. Ethan, danger. Watcher, get out. Now. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the signal was gone, swallowed by the relentless static. Ethan frantically turned the dial, but the voice didn't return. He slammed his fist on the desk in frustration, the echo of the message looping in his mind. The Watcher, get out, now. Ethan's hand trembled as he switched off the radio, the dread settling back into his bones. The message was clear. He was in danger, and whoever had tried to warn him was either too far away to help or had met the same fate as the missing hiker. He couldn't stay here, isolated and alone, waiting for the Watcher to make its move. But leaving wasn't an option either. The forest was vast, and the path out of the park would take days to navigate, even if he could manage to find it again in the twisted landscape. No, he was trapped, just as Mrs. Havisham had said, trapped in the Watcher's domain, with no one to rely on but himself. He paced the cabin, trying to form a plan. He had to be proactive, had to find a way to protect himself. The flare gun, the bear spray, they seemed woefully inadequate against a force as ancient and malevolent as the Watcher. He needed something more, something that could give him an edge, even if it was only temporary. His eyes fell on the box of supplies he had brought with him, a mix of standard ranger gear and personal belongings. He rummaged through it, pulling out a heavy-duty flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and a few other essentials. As he did, his hand brushed against something hard and metallic at the bottom of the box. Ethan frowned and pulled it out, a small portable signal booster he had nearly forgotten about. It was a gift from a friend, designed to amplify weak radio signals in remote areas. He hadn't thought he would need it, but now it seemed like his best chance of reaching someone outside the park. He quickly set it up next to the radio, connecting the cables and adjusting the settings. The booster hummed to life, a small green light blinking steadily. He turned the radio back on, the static immediately filling the cabin again. But this time it was different, sharper, more focused. He fine-tuned the frequency, praying for a miracle. Station 21, this is Ethan Cole. He spoke into the microphone, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. If anyone can hear me, please respond. The static continued for a few agonizing seconds, and then, faintly, a voice emerged. Ethan, this is HQ. What's your status? Relief washed over him like a wave. He had made contact. He wasn't alone. This is Cole, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. I'm at Station 21. There's something in the woods, something dangerous. I've lost contact with everyone else. The hiker is missing, and there's this creature. I think it's hunting me. I need help. The voice on the other end was barely audible, but it carried a tone of urgency. Understood, Cole. We're sending a team. Get out. Stay inside. At all costs. The connection began to crackle, the voice fading in and out. Ethan gripped the microphone tighter, his pulse quickening. I can't just stay inside. I need to know what's out there. Is there anything you can tell me? Anything that can help? The response was fragmented, as if the signal was being pulled apart by the very air around him. Watcher, ancient, stay, don't. Door. The static surged, drowning out the last of the message. Ethan's heart sank as the connection was lost completely. The green light on the signal booster flickered, then went dark. Whatever tenuous link he had managed to establish was gone. He stared at the radio in disbelief, his mind racing. HQ had confirmed his worst fears. The Watcher was real, and it was dangerous. But they had told him to stay inside, to not open the door. Why? What did they know that he didn't? What was this creature capable of? The cabin suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in around him. He couldn't just sit here and wait for the Watcher to make its move. He had to do something, anything, to take control of the situation. Ethan checked his gear one more time, making sure everything was in place. The flare gun, the flashlight, the knife, they were all ready, but they felt insignificant against the looming threat. He needed to be smarter, to think like a ranger and use his surroundings to his advantage. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. The forest was still and quiet, the mist hanging low over the ground. Ethan scanned the tree line, his senses on high alert. The Watcher was out there somewhere watching him, waiting for the right moment. Ethan moved cautiously around the cabin, checking the perimeter. The old rusted traps set up by previous rangers were still there, useless against something as powerful as the Watcher. But the symbols carved into the trees near the cabin, they might be his only hope. Mrs. Havisham had warned him that the symbols were dangerous, that they attracted the Watcher instead of repelling it. But Ethan had a different idea. If the Watcher was drawn to the symbols, maybe he could use them to his advantage, lure it into a trap of his own making. He quickly went to work, using a piece of chalk to replicate the symbols on the trees, amplifying their presence. He didn't fully understand the ancient language, but he knew enough to mimic the patterns, hoping it would have the desired effect. As he finished the last symbol, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air around him grew colder, the shadows deeper. The forest seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if responding to the symbols he had carved. Ethan stepped back, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He knew the Watcher was near. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and causing the trees to sway. Ethan's hand tightened around the handle of his knife, the cold metal comforting in his grip. He scanned the tree line again, searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw it, a dark figure moving through the mist just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was the same figure he had seen before, tall and shadowy, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. The Watcher. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched the figure approach, its movements slow and deliberate. It was heading straight for the cabin, drawn by the symbols he had carved. His plan was working. He had lured the Watcher into the open. But as the creature drew closer, Ethan's confidence began to waver. The Watcher was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Its presence was overwhelming, oppressive, as if it carried the weight of centuries of darkness and pain. The very air around it seemed to warp and bend, distorting reality. Ethan took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The Watcher paused at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering in and out of focus. It was studying him, assessing him with a cold, calculating gaze. The wind howled through the trees, and For a moment, Ethan thought he heard whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind. He remembered Mrs. Haversham's warning, never listen to the whispers. But the words were so soft, so enticing, that he found himself straining to hear them. The watcher took another step forward, its shadow stretching across the ground like a living thing. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the creature's eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto his. And then, without warning, the watcher lunged at him. Ethan fired the flare gun, the bright red light exploding into the air with a deafening crack. The watcher recoiled, its form flickering and distorting in the light. For a brief moment, it seemed to lose its shape, dissolving into a mass of swirling shadows. Ethan didn't waste any time. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the ground as he sprinted toward the cabin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with dark, twisted thoughts. He pushed them away, focusing only on reaching the safety of the cabin. He burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him and locking it tight. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the flare outside. Ethan leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his mind racing. The watcher was still out there, but it was angry now. He could feel its presence pressing against the walls of the cabin, like a storm building on the horizon. The whispers were all around him, seeping through the cracks in the wood, invading his thoughts. Ethan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to listen, to give in to the darkness. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not when he was so close. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of the watcher's presence, but it held. For now, Ethan knew this wasn't over. The watcher was relentless, and it would keep coming until it got what it wanted. But he was prepared now, ready to face whatever came next. He moved to the table where the map lay spread out. He had one more trick up his sleeve, one final gambit that might just give him the edge he needed. He just hoped it would be enough. Outside, the wind howled, and the shadows pressed closer, but Ethan was no longer afraid. He was determined, focused, ready to do whatever it took to survive. The watcher had underestimated him, and now it was his turn to strike. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth. The forest was ancient, powerful, and it had already chosen its prey, and he was alone. The dawn broke over Greystone National Park with a gray, overcast sky that seemed to press down on the forest like a heavy blanket. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around the base of the trees in ghostly tendrils. Ethan Cole had spent another restless night in the cabin, the walls creaking under the strain of the watcher's oppressive presence. The whispers had receded with the first light of day, but their echoes still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that he was not alone. He sat at the small wooden table, staring at the map spread out before him. His eyes traced the lines of the trails, the landmarks, the places he had already searched. But there was one area that he had yet to explore, a place that Mrs. Haversham had mentioned in passing during their conversation, the old village. Ethan hadn't given much thought to the idea of a village deep in the forest. It didn't appear on any of the official maps, and there was no record of it in the ranger station's archives. But Mrs. Haversham's words echoed in his mind. The villagers disappeared overnight, without a trace. Some say the Watcher took them, Others say they left to escape something far worse. The thought of an entire village vanishing sent a chill down Ethan's spine. What could have caused such a thing? And why had it been forgotten, erased from the park's history? The questions gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. If he was going to find answers, if he was going to survive, he needed to uncover the truth about the village and its connection to the Watcher. With a sense of grim determination, Ethan packed his gear, making sure to bring extra supplies. The village was located deep in the northern part of the park, far from any established trails. It would take hours to reach, and the terrain was treacherous. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. Whatever secrets the village held, they might be his only hope of understanding the ancient force that stalked him. The journey was slow and arduous, the forest growing denser and more tangled with each passing mile. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches interwoven like a massive living cage. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Hours passed as Ethan made his way deeper into the heart of the park. The landscape became increasingly rugged, the ground uneven and covered in thick underbrush. Several times he had to stop and consult his map, trying to orient himself in the disorienting maze of trees. But despite the difficulty, he pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he came upon a narrow, overgrown trail that seemed to lead in the direction of the village. The path was barely discernible, choked with weeds and covered in fallen leaves. It was clear that no one had traveled this way in many years. But there was something else, an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the trail, every nerve on edge. The mist thickened, the trees closing in around him. And then through the haze he saw it, a cluster of dark shapes looming ahead. The village. The first building he approached was a small, crumbling structure made of weathered wood and stone. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were broken, their glass long gone. Ethan stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with debris, rotting wood, broken furniture, and the remnants of a life long abandoned. He moved through the village slowly, carefully, taking in the eerie silence that hung over the place like a shroud. Each building told the same story, empty, decaying, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of where the villagers might have gone. It was as if they had been plucked from existence, leaving only their possessions behind. Ethan's unease grew with each step, the weight of the village's history pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows cast by the broken buildings were more than just tricks of the light. The Watcher's presence was here, palpable and suffocating, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. In the center of the village, Ethan came upon a large, circular clearing, where the remains of a communal fire pit stood. Around the edges of the clearing were several stone benches, their surfaces worn smooth by time. And there, at the far end of the clearing, stood a structure that was different from the rest, larger, more imposing, and made of stone rather than wood. The building was a small chapel, its roof caved in, but its stone walls still standing strong. A sense of dread washed over Ethan as he approached the entrance, the wooden door hanging off its hinges. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The chapel was small, with a single row of wooden pews, most of which had rotted away. At the front of the room stood an altar made of the same stone as the walls, but covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones Ethan had seen carved into the trees near Station 21. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the symbols. They were intricate, winding patterns, their meaning lost to time. But there was something else, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. Behind the altar, etched into the stone wall, was a large circular symbol, a spiral with lines radiating out from its center. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. As he did, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the chapel, vibrating through the walls and the floor. He stepped back, his heart racing, as the ground beneath him began to tremble. Suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The ground shook violently, cracks appearing in the stone floor. Ethan stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as the walls of the chapel seemed to close in around him. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Ethan stood frozen, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He turned his attention back to the altar, and his eyes widened in horror. The spiral symbol on the wall had changed. Where there had once been lines radiating out from the center, there were now dozens of small, jagged cracks, each one oozing a thick, black substance that looked like tar. The substance began to spread, creeping across the stone like a living thing, forming new patterns as it moved. Ethan watched in disbelief as the black ooze traced the symbols on the altar, connecting them in a way that hadn't been visible before. The patterns now formed a clear image, an eye staring directly at him. Ethan's blood ran cold. The Watcher was here, its presence unmistakable. The villagers hadn't just disappeared, they had been taken, claimed by whatever ancient force resided in this place. And now it was reaching out to him, pulling him deeper into its web. He had to get out. Ethan turned and ran from the chapel, his boots pounding against the uneven ground. He burst out into the clearing, the cold air hitting him like a slap to the face. But he didn't stop, didn't look back. He had seen enough. The village seemed to come alive as he fled, the mist swirling around him, the shadows growing darker and more twisted. He could feel the Watcher's presence closing in, pressing down on him from all sides. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches reaching out like claws, trying to drag him back into the darkness. Ethan's lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep running, his heart pounding in his chest. The path ahead was barely visible, the mist thickening, but he didn't care. He had to get back to the cabin, had to put as much distance between himself and that cursed village as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the familiar sight of the cabin came into view. Ethan stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He reached the door, fumbling with the handle before finally shoving it open and collapsing inside. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his body shaking with adrenaline. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. But it was safe from the Watcher, from the village, from whatever dark forces had claimed the lives of those who had lived there. Ethan sank to the floor, his back against the door, his mind racing. He had uncovered part of the mystery, but at what cost? The Watcher was more powerful than he had ever imagined, its reach extending far beyond the boundaries of the forest, and now it had its sights set on him. The villagers had tried to escape, tried to flee from the darkness that had consumed their home. But they had failed, and now Ethan was in the same position, trapped in a battle against an ancient force that he couldn't hope to defeat. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his resolve hardening. He had come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. There had to be a way to stop the Watcher, to break the hold it had over the forest and over him. He moved to the table where the map still lay spread out. His hands were steady now, his fear replaced by a cold, determined focus. The village had given him answers, but it had also raised more questions. Questions that needed answers if he was going to survive. The Watcher was ancient, powerful, and relentless. But Ethan was a ranger, and he knew the land better than anyone. He would find a way to turn the forest against the creature, to use its own domain to defeat it. But for now, he needed to rest, to gather his strength for the battle that was to come. The Watcher had made its move, but Ethan wasn't about to be taken without a fight. He closed the map and headed to the cot, the weight of the day's revelations settling over him. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the dying fire. But outside, the forest was alive with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. And Ethan knew that the real battle was only just beginning. Ethan sat on the edge of his cot, his body weighed down by exhaustion and the oppressive dread that had settled over Station 21. The events of the day, the discovery of the abandoned village, the strange, malevolent symbols, the presence of the Watcher had drained him, both physically and mentally. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. The cabin was silent save for the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. Outside, the forest was shrouded in darkness, the mist thicker than ever. It was as if the very air was conspiring to suffocate him, to keep him trapped in this nightmarish place. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of what he had uncovered, of the Watcher's growing presence, and of the unseen forces that seemed to be closing in around him. He knew that the Watcher wasn't just some malevolent spirit haunting the woods. It was something far older, something tied to the land itself. And now, whatever it was, it had him in its sights. The sense of being watched had grown stronger since his return from the village, an almost tangible presence that seemed to linger just beyond the reach of his senses. He reached for the small notebook on the table, flipping through the pages of hastily scrawled notes and sketches. The symbols from the village, the spiral, the black substance that had oozed from the walls. It all pointed to something ancient and dark, something that had been buried in these woods for centuries. But what was it? And what did it want? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and causing the door to groan on its hinges. Ethan looked up, his grip tightening on the notebook. He could feel the Watcher's presence pressing against the walls of the cabin like a storm waiting to break. It was as if the entire forest was alive with a dark energy, a force that was slowly but surely tightening its grip on him. Suddenly, the cabin was plunged into darkness as the last embers in the fireplace died out, leaving Ethan in complete silence. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively reached for the flashlight on the table, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the